Paris, 1871. The empire has collapsed, the government has fled, and the Prussians have ringed around the city. They've starved it, humiliated it, and left it simmering with rage. The people of Paris are armed, the workers are furious, and the rich are terrified. And somewhere between patriotism, revolution, hunger, and a political hallucination, a city decides it no longer wants to be governed from above. So it tries something else. So today on Naked History, we're going to be heading to Paris for a story that has everything. War, political collapse, cannons on a hill, workers taking over a major European capital, the French government making several extremely bad decisions in a row, and enough barricades to make urban planning officials physically ill. This is the story of the Paris Commune. 72 days in 1871, when Paris looked at the ruins of empire, the failures of government, and the general state of things, and basically said, oh, you know what? We'll just do it ourselves. And for a brief, blazing moment, they did. It was hopeful, it was messy, it was radical. It was fueled by hunger, anger, patriotism, idealism, and the kind of political tension that makes every public meeting feel like it could turn into either a revolution or a fistfight, or probably both. Because this wasn't just a protest, this was a full-on attempt to remake the city, and maybe even society itself, while the rest of France stared in horror. Europe clutched its pearls, and the forces of order prepared to solve the problem the traditional way, with artillery and a body count. So today, we're talking about dreams, panic, class warfare, public reform, revolutionary women, catastrophic repression, and what happens when ordinary people stop asking for permission and start asking who put these idiots in charge in the first place. Let's take a look at the 72 days that terrified Europe. To understand how Paris got here, to red flags, barricades, and civil war in the streets, you have to start with a city that was already exhausted, angry, armed, and very nearly out of patience. Because by the time the Commune arrived in the spring of 1871, Paris had already been through siege, starvation, military humiliation, and the complete collapse of the government that was supposed to be holding the country together. And when people had been freezing, starving, and watching their leaders embarrass themselves on a national scale, they don't usually become calmer. They just become more dangerous. By 1870, France is ruled by Napoleon III, the nephew of the more famous Napoleon Bonaparte, which is already one of history's great "the sequel is never going to be good" situations. His regime, the Second Empire, is authoritarian but polished. It likes spectacle, prestige, modernization, and the general vibe of pretending everything is stable as long as the boulevards are wide and the newspapers are somewhat obedient. Paris itself had also been transformed. Medieval neighborhoods had been smashed open by Baron Haussmann's vast redesign, instituting broad avenues, big vistas, monumental architecture, cleaner lines, and a lot more imperial grandeur. And conveniently, streets are that much harder to barricade. Because whenever a government says it is redesigning a capital city for beauty, hygiene, and order, there's always a decent chance the secret fourth reason is, and we're so tired of revolutions. And Paris had a habit of those. 1789, 1790, 1791, the city itself had a long history of looking to authority and saying, interesting, but what if not? Now, underneath the polished imperial surface, Paris was full of inequality. Political resentment, labor unrest, radical journalism, Republican oppression, and the lingering memory that ordinary people had toppled governments before and could probably do it again if sufficiently annoyed. And then came war. In 1870, Napoleon III and his government stumble into the Franco-Prussian War, and it goes disastrously almost immediately. This is not one of those wars where everyone says, well, there was mistakes on both sides, so no. France gets hammered. The French army is completely outmatched, outmaneuvered, and increasingly humiliated. And then, in September of 1870, comes the catastrophe at Sedan. Napoleon III is captured. And capturing is usually not considered great for a reigning emperor. So, as a result, the Second Empire collapses, and in Paris, a new republican government is declared, the Government of National Defense. On paper, it exists to continue the war and defend France. In practice, it inherits a disaster with very few good options. So now, as a result, Paris is under siege. The Prussians surround the city. Food in Paris runs low and conditions deteriorate. Horses are eaten, and then the zoo animals. Which is one of those details that sounds like historical trivia until you remember it means that everyone is starving. And when people are starving, freezing, angry, humiliated, and armed, politics tend to become a lot less theoretical. Now, the Siege of Paris lasts from September 1870 into January of 1871, and it changes everything. The National Guard, which had once been more of a traditional citizen militia, swells massively in size. Tens of thousands of ordinary Parisians join. Workers, shopkeepers, artisans, clerks, laborers, men who are defending their neighborhoods, their city, and increasingly their political dignity. Because the regular army and the government had seemed increasingly more and more ineffective, the National Guard becomes more of a military force in physical. It also becomes political. It becomes more local and democratic in parts, but mostly all over distrustful of elites. Suspicious that the people suffering most are not the people making the decisions. And this matters, because by the time the siege ends, Paris is not just battered, it is politically radicalized. And then comes the armistice, and for many Parisians, it feels like betrayal. The Government of National Defense surrenders in January of 1871. Elections are held for a new National Assembly, but there's a problem. Much of rural France, exhausted by war and less radical than Paris, votes for conservatives and monarchists who want peace and order. Paris looks at this assembly and basically says, oh, fantastic, the provinces have elected a government to tell the capital to calm down, pay up, and behave. I'm sure it went well. The new government settles at Versailles under Adolphe Thiers, a veteran statesman with all the warm accessibility of a locked filing cabinet. He is cautious, conservative, and deeply hostile to revolutionary Paris, and very much committed to restoring state authority. Paris, the city, meanwhile, is armed, hungry, proud, but still resentful, and in no mood to be managed from Versailles by men it does not trust. And then there are the cannons. Yes, the cannons. Because during the siege, the National Guard and Parisian neighborhoods had paid for artillery by public subscription. These guns were seen not as state property in the abstract, but as something the people of Paris had helped acquire in defense of the city. Now, Thiers decided that they must be taken back, which in a less volatile situation might have been tense, but in this situation, it's like trying to solve a grease fire by throwing in fireworks. On the morning of March 18, 1871, government troops move into Paris to seize the cannons stationed on the heights of Montmartre and elsewhere in the city. The operation itself is badly handled from the jump. The troops arrive early, but the horses needed to move the artillery are delayed. So crowds begin to gather. Local residents and crucially women from the neighborhood confront the soldiers. The atmosphere turns tense, then confused, then transformative, because the soldiers do not behave as expected. Instead of firing on the crowd, many begin to hesitate. Some fraternize, and some refuse orders. The line between army and people starts to dissolve in real time. And this is one of those moments history loves, the instant when authority expects obedience and instead gets a shrug, a moral crisis, and a rapidly transforming insurrection. Two generals, Claude Lecompte and Jacques-Léon Clement Thomas, are captured and later killed by insurgents. The exact chain of tensions and decisions remains messy, emotional, and chaotic, but politically the meaning is clear. Versailles has tried to reassert control, and Paris has staunchly confused. Thiers and the government pull back to Versailles, and what they leave behind is astonishing. They abandon the capital. Not permanently, of course, they fully intend to return, but in the immediate sense, the central government has lost Paris, and power flows into that vacuum. The National Guard Central Committee takes charge, at least temporarily. Barricades rise, red flags appear, and radical newspapers flourish. Clubs and committees hum with debate, and elections are called for a new municipal government. And that government will soon call itself the Commune. And now I should pause here because the Commune can sound like one coherent block with one tidy ideology and one laminated policy sheet, but it was anything but that. The Paris Commune was a coalition, a volatile, improvised, and emotionally charged coalition. Jacobins inspired by the French Revolution, socialists of various stripes, radical Republicans, Blanquists who liked insurrection maybe a little too much, proud uninfluenced mutualists, secular reformers, workers, advocates, neighborhood patriots, people who just wanted municipal autonomy, and people who wanted social revolution, and people who mostly wanted Versailles just to get bent. And this mix gave the Commune energy, but also a lot of confusion. It was united by opposition more than a single consistent blueprint. And still, what happens next is extraordinary. On March 26, elections are held, and on March 28th, the Commune is formally proclaimed. For the supporters of the movement, this is the beginning of something new, a democratic social republic rooted in the people of Paris. For its enemies, it is the opening act of apocalypse. And I do mean apocalypse. Across Europe, conservative observers react to the Commune with a special kind of panic, usually reserved for plague, invasion, or a cousin announcing that he has become an amateur crypto-philosopher. The fear is not just that Paris is rebellious. Paris had done that before. The fear is that this time ordinary workers might actually try to govern. And that possibility, however improvised, however unstable, and however brief, is what makes the Commune so explosive in memory. So what did the Commune actually do? Well, quite a lot, especially for a government trying to function during siege conditions with limited resources, constant internal disputes, and a hostile national government preparing to crush it. The Commune embraced the language of democratic accountability. Officials were to be elected and, in principle, recallable. Public service was to be less about status and more about function. There was a deep hostility to hierarchy, privilege, clerical power, or the old structures that seemed to protect wealth while demanding sacrifice from everyone else. Rents accumulated during the siege were remitted. Pawned goods were, in some cases, protected from sale or reclaimable, which mattered enormously to the poor because pawning possessions had become a survival tactic. Night work in bakeries was abolished. There were efforts to reopen workshops abandoned by owners and place them under cooperative control. The church and state were pushed apart with unusual force, and religious symbols and clerical authority were challenged in schools and civic life. Education reform was discussed with seriousness, and secular instruction, universal access, and practical training became a part of the revolutionary conversation. And then there were the women. Because one of the most important things about the Commune is that the women were everywhere in it, organizing, speaking, nursing, publishing, agitating, building barricades, demanding social transformation, and refusing to remain decorative witnesses to history. The women did not receive full political equality under the Commune in a formal modern sense, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the uprising opened public space in radical ways. Women's political clubs flourished. Activists like Louise Michel became legendary. The Union des Femmes, associated with figures like Elisabeth Dimitrieff and Nathalie Lemel, pushed for labor rights, social welfare, and more expansive revolutionary roles for women in the defense and restructuring of Paris. Louise Michel, in particular, becomes one of the most enduring faces of the Commune. A teacher, a militant, a fierce public voice, and later one of its great memorializers. If the Commune had saints, and revolutions usually try not to have saints, but always accidentally produces them. Louise Michel would be one of them. The Commune also had a strong anti-clerical streak, which makes sense when you consider how many radicals saw the church as aligned with the old hierarchies, monarchy, obedience, and social conservatism. So the Commune's reforms were aimed not only at governance, but at culture. Who had moral authority, who shaped the children, and who counted as the nation. And that gets at the deepest level of the Commune. It was not merely a municipal revolt over local administration, it was a battle over what society ought to be. Should France be centralized, conservative, differential, clerical, and police from above, or should it be democratic, social, secular, federal, and reorganized from below? The argument was not unique to Paris in 1871, but in the Commune it was lived with muskets. Now, did the Commune solve everything? Oh, no. Good Lord, no. It struggled with coordination, military organization, finance. It had extensive internal rivalries and strategic clarity. Some leaders wanted aggressive action against Versailles immediately. Others hesitated, and there were debates over whether to prioritize administration, symbolism, or war. Some measures were bold but unevenly implemented, and the revolutionary state it imagined was still being invented while under mortal threat. It was less a polished government than a city trying to improvise a new society while someone was loading artillery outside the walls. Which, to be fair, is not ideal working conditions. Still, for those who believed in it, the Commune represented something electric. Not just revolt, but possibility. And that possibility is exactly why its enemies were determined to erase it. From Versailles, Adolphe Thiers watched Paris with cold determination. He was not interested in compromise that leaves the capital effectively autonomous and armed under radical control. To him, and to much of the French political establishment, the Commune is not an eccentric municipal disagreement. It is rebellion, treason. It is social contagion and a direct threat to civilization, property, order, religion, and everything respectable people like to stack in neat columns. So Versailles begins to prepare for war. And here's one of the most brutal little ironies in history. Even as France is recovering from its defeat by Prussia, the French state is actively preparing to wage civil war against its own capital. Prisoners of war are gradually released and forces are reorganized. The army of Versailles grows stronger. Meanwhile, the Commune makes some serious mistakes. One of the most famous is its failure to capitalize early. In the first days of March 18th, Versailles was vulnerable. The government is completely disorganized and the situation is fluid. Some believed an immediate march on Versailles might have changed the balance. But revolutions often suffer from the problem of becoming real too suddenly. Everyone is full of energy, but not always coordination. And by the time the Commune mounts military action, it is hesitant, inconsistent, and unsuccessful. And that lost momentum matters, because Versailles has time to breathe, has time to consolidate, recruit, and frame the narrative. Paris is in the hands of criminals, fanatics, atheists, incendiaries, and social maniacs. The press, hostile to the Commune, amplifies horror stories. Some of them are exaggerated, some are fabricated, but some are rooted in very real violence, but expanded into civilization-level panic. And that panic serves a purpose. Because once you can convince the public that your enemies are monsters, shooting them in bulk starts to sound like sanitation. Now, skirmishes intensify through April and May. Versailles forces press the outskirts of the city, and the Commune responds with decrees, mobilization, and increasingly desperate rhetoric. There are attempts to create stronger executive structures, including controversial Committee of Public Safeties, a name that, if you know your French Revolutionary history, is a bit like naming your office team-building committee the mildly concerning Guillotine Society. Now, the very use of that term should tell you something. Commune leaders were drawing on revolutionary memory, sometimes proudly, sometimes recklessly. And they were aware that they were acting in the shadow of 1793, and not everyone thought that was reassuring. Now, still, the morale in Paris was fierce. Paris was covered in barricades, and neighborhoods prepared their defenses. Political clubs continued meeting and newspapers kept printing. Life and revolution coexisted in a way that is very strange to observe, but it's just usually how they do. People still had to eat, argue, mend clothes, deliver messages, bury the dead, and decide whether history was on their side. And then, in late May, the gates began to open. On May 21st, 1871, Versailles troops enter Paris through a poorly defended gate near St. Cloud. What follows is known as La Semaine Sanguinante, or the Bloody Week. And this is where the story turns from radical experiment into urban massacre. The fighting is savage. Street by street, barricade by barricade, the western neighborhoods fall first, then the battle moves eastward into districts more deeply associated with working-class Paris and the Commune's strongest support. The Communards fight hard, often with desperation and courage, but are increasingly outmatched. The Versailles army is larger, better organized, and better armed, and operating with a very clear goal: total suppression of the city of Paris. Barricades rise all across the city. Some are symbolic, some are tactical, and some are hopeless. Men, women, and sometimes even children assist in the defense. Messengers run through the gunfire, and priests are seized as hostages in some areas. Public buildings begin to burn. And this is another part of the Commune's legacy that becomes mythos almost immediately: the fires. As the Commune collapses, major buildings in Paris go up in flames, including the Tuileries Palace and the Hôtel de Ville. Some are deliberately set by retreating communards or insurgents, and some fires emerge mid-combat and shelling. The symbolism, however, is enormous. To enemies of the Commune, it is confirmed that the rebels were nihilistic arsonists bent on destroying civilization itself. To some supporters, the burning of imperial and state capitals had revolutionary meaning. Either way, Paris becomes a furnace. And then comes the killing. Versailles troops execute prisoners in large numbers. Summary shootings take place all over the city, and suspected communards are lined up against walls and shot. Men found with signs of fighting, powder burns, uniforms, calloused hands, or the wrong neighborhood affiliations are also at risk. Women are accused of being pétroleuses, or supposed female arsonists, in an immoral panic that combine misogyny, class hatred, and raw vengeance. Some women did participate directly in combat and resistance, yes, but the hysteria around them became part of the broader demonization of the defeated. By the final days, eastern Paris becomes a killing field. One of the most infamous sites is the wall of Père-Lachaise Cemetery, where captured communards are executed. The Mur des Fédérés becomes one of the most enduring memorial sites of the Commune, a place where memory hardens into stone. The last of the barricades fall by May 28th. The Commune is over. How many are killed in the fighting? Well, the exact number is still debated because mass repression is rarely tidy in its record-keeping. But the death toll is unquestionably enormous. Thousands are executed during Blood Week alone, and tens of thousands more are arrested. Many are imprisoned, tried, deported, or exiled. New Caledonia becomes one destination for deportees, including Louis Michel. Others flee abroad, especially to Britain, Belgium, and Switzerland. The repression is not just military, it is exemplary. The state sends a message. This is what happens when Paris tries this again, and Europe hears it. And you now might be wondering, if it only lasted 72 days and ended in total disaster, why did the Paris Commune become so important? Well, because sometimes a failed revolution leaves a larger shadow than a successful government. The Commune becomes a symbol almost immediately, but not the same symbol to everyone. To conservatives, it was proof of the horrors latent in socialism. Democracy run wild, anti-clericalism, urban crowds, women in politics, and workers with rifles. It became a nightmare image of civilization inverted. The servants ruling the masters, laborers legislating, churches being humiliated, property threatened, the old authority mocked and the city itself turning into a battleground. To radicalists, socialists, and later anarchists, the Commune became something else, a martyr and a model. Karl Marx famously embraced the Commune as a major example of proletarian political action, even though sympathetic observers debated what exactly it had achieved and what lessons should be drawn from it. Later revolutionaries pored over its successes and failures. Was it too decentralized? Was it too hesitant, too merciful at first? Maybe it was too symbolic or not organized enough. Maybe if it branched out from Paris. And these arguments would echo for decades. Vladimir Lenin studied it, anarchists claimed parts of its legacy, and social democrats memorialized it. Labor movements invoked it, and its songs, names, and martyrs and anniversaries became part of left-wing political culture across Europe and abroad. And memory matters. Because the Commune was not just an event, it became a warning and a promise. A warning from above, never let the city slip. A promise from below, another world, however fragile, was imaginable. And that is why its memory is so fiercely contested. Was it criminal chaos, heroic resistance, premature revolution, democratic municipalism, social republic, urban civil war, or maybe even political delirium under impossible conditions? Honestly, it's a bit of all the above. The Commune resists easy summary because it was made in emergency, and emergency has a way of stripping people down to conviction, fear, improvisation, and contradiction. Its leaders were not all wise. Its decisions were not all good. Its violence, however, was real. Its administrative reach was uneven, and it could be romanticized too easy by later admirers who preferred myth to complexity. But the reaction against it was so fiercely beyond justification. The slaughter that ended it was not a regrettable footnote. It was central. The ruling order did not merely defeat the Commune, it sought to annihilate its legitimacy by drowning it in blood and scandal. And that alone tells you how seriously it was taken. One of the reasons the Paris Commune still grips people is that it is crowded with unforgettable human figures. Louise Michel stands tallest in the memory. A school teacher, a radical, an ambulance worker, and a militant. A writer and a woman who emerged from the Commune not broken into silence, but sharpened into legend. Arrested after the fall of the Commune, she embraced responsibility rather than pleading distance. She was deported and later returned to France, still defiant, still radical, and still impossible to package neatly into something harmless. Then there were the women whose names were less famous, but whose presence made the Commune what it was. Organizers in clubs and committees, seamstresses, teachers, laborers, nurses, propagandists, defenders of barricades. The Commune exposed again one of history's favorite habits. When women help make a revolution, society often praises the people, afterward while quietly trying to push the women back out of the frame. The fear directed at women in Bloody Week is especially revealing. The myth of the Pétroluce, a crazed female incendiary with kerosene and revolutionary hatred in her apron pocket, became a cultural obsession because it condensed so many elite anxieties into one target. Class anxiety, political anxiety, gender panic, the idea that not only had the poor rebelled, but women among the poor had become agents of destruction. And it's the same old story, really. Men start war, governments wreck a country, class systems fail, half the population while the cities burn. And suddenly everyone becomes extremely interested in whether a woman looked too determined near a public building. Now, the Commune also haunted Paris physically. The rebuilt city moved forward, but the memory never fully left. Cemeteries, plaques, anniversaries, songs, and family stories kept it alive. The dead of the Commune joined that strange fraternity of historical afterlives in which a movement can be defeated materially and still keep showing up ideologically at every inconvenient moment. And inconvenient it was. Because every labor strike, every socialist march, every debate about democracy, class, secularism, public education, women's rights, and state violence could, in some way, summon the ghost of 1871. The title of this episode is Hope, Fear, and Brutal Endings. And it's plural because the Paris Commune did not just end once. It ended militarily in May of 1871, yes, but it also ended over and over in the lives of the people caught inside it. It ended in the neighborhoods shattered by artillery, in the families who never found the bodies, in the prisoners who were marched away, in the schools, clubs, dreams, and reforms cut off before they could become routine, in the memory of what had almost became normal. And maybe that's one of the saddest things about the Commune. Not just that it failed, but for a brief moment, it stopped feeling impossible. The people were not only fighting, they were governing, debating, reforming, and imagining. They were treating a different social order not just as fantasy, but as a municipal problem with paperwork, shortages, it had committees and arguments about bakeries. And that may sound less glamorous than the barricades, but it's actually more radical. Because rebellion is one thing, administration is a whole different animal. Plenty of people can dream of tearing down the old world, but far fewer get to the stage of saying, all right then, who is running the schools? What about rents? Can we reopen the workshop? Now, should officials be recallable? And what do we do with the church? Now, who gets fed first? And for 72 days, Paris asked these questions out loud, and Europe never quite forgot it. The Paris Commune lasted just 72 days, barely more than 2 months, less time than some reality television contracts, and less time than it takes a bad idea in government to become a task force. And yet, its impact far outlasted its life. It terrified the powerful because it suggested ordinary people might not only revolt, but rule. It inspired the left because it made revolution look human, local, imperfect, and very possible. It horrified Europe with fire and execution. It inspired generations of courage and memory, and it was noble, chaotic, visionary, divided, brave, reckless, and doomed. In other words, it was history in its rawest form. People trying to build a future while trapped inside of a catastrophe. And maybe that's why it still feels modern. Because beneath the uniforms and barricades, the arguments are familiar. Who owns the city? Who does the state protect? What happens when ordinary people lose faith in institutions? And when does reform feel too slow? And when does order become violence wearing a respectable coat? How quickly do those in power call something chaos when the wrong people start making decisions? And the Commune asked all of that, and it paid for the question in blood. So the next time someone tells you history is just kings, treaties, and speeches, remember Paris in the spring of 1871. A city full of workers, teachers, radicals, soldiers, women organizers, frightened officials, and exhausted families trying to decide whether the world had to stay the way it was. And for 72 days, they said no. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Naked History, where we rip the fig leaf off the past to reveal the absurd, the extraordinary, and the devastatingly human. I have been Dyllan Gasaway, and if you enjoyed this episode, follow the show, leave a review, and share it with someone who likes the revolutions historically significant and emotionally complicated. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing in history is not a weapon. It's an idea that ordinary people might be able to run the place themselves. So thank you for listening, and as always, remember to stay weird, stay curious, and stay naked. Historically speaking, of course. We'll see you in the next one.